So, dear community of science journalists in MENA, I'm happy to welcome you to our third meetup of science journalists in MENA. I'm Dr. Nouha Belaid, University Lecturer and Science Journalist from Tunisia. So in the beginning, I would love to wish you a new year full of beautiful surprise, but also a healthy year. I would love to share with you our 7 healthy New Year's resolutions you can actually keep, like lose weight and keep it off, eat a healthy diet, sit less, move more, schedule an annual checkup, take steps to reduce stress, get more sleeps, and create a plan to stop smoking, if you want. For those who joined us for the first time, Science Journalists in MENA is a WhatsApp group that aims to exchange the latest news, like scientific reports, webinar invitations, and press release about science. The principal language is English, but we are planning for the next meetups to invite some Arabic and French-speaking experts to satisfy our community, because without your support, we can't be motivated for this bi-weekly meetup. I would like also to highlight that this group is not affiliated with any party. It's an individual initiative that I launched last October to spread knowledge in the Arab world. It's based on teamwork and the expertise of experts in the field of journalism and science. And I would like to acknowledge those who have contributed to the success of our WhatsApp group, like our colleague Utema, the last month. So thank you for being a part of this community. Thank you for your generosity. But following the survey launched 2 weeks ago, we won't be limited to sharing knowledge. We will organize some training sessions in the future. And please, if you are an NGO, an academic or research institution, or even a private company involved in the field of science, don't hesitate to contact me to present your initiative. This virtual meetup is open to all actors if you want to talk about science. Regarding our meetup today, I would like to share with you some rules. Today, we will start with like a PowerPoint presentation. It will last less than 13 minutes. After that, you can raise your hands and ask questions directly to our speaker. I will present our speaker in a few minutes. You can also use the chat for any comments. So today, we are happy to welcome Ehsan Masood, editor for Editorials and Bureau Chief for Africa and the Middle East of Nature magazine. And who is Ehsan Masood? Like a short biography. He's a science policy journalist. He's the editor for Editorials at the journal Nature, and also has responsibility for Nature's coverage of Africa and the Middle East. Ehsan is the author of a number of books and has made documentary programs for BBC Radio on science, finance, history, and belief. His latest book was about the world's most powerful formula and why it must now change in 2021. He's also the author of Science and Islam, another book, and also titled BBC Radio and TV series. He studied before physics at the University UK and science communication also in UK at the University of London. He's a former Night Science Journalism Fellow. So many things to say about Ehsan. Maybe like I have to give you like the floor is yours to talk about yourself more and to present your experience. Thank you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Nouha.
And sorry if it was a long presentation at the beginning, but like at the beginning of the year. So.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation as well, and to speak to your members. It's always really exciting to speak to scientists and to science writers and science journalists and science communicators from different countries, and particularly, of course, with my interests in particularly in the Middle East. As Nouha said, I'm Ehsan Masood. I am a UK-based science writer and science editor. I work for Nature, and I have just some different responsibilities at Nature. One of them is our editorials, and another responsibility is our news coverage, our journalism, essentially, from the countries of Africa and the Middle East. And Nouha asked me to talk a little bit about Nature, and which is what I'm going to do in this presentation that I'll do. And this is mostly about the research publishing aspects of Nature. And then, and I'll speak to maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And then after that, I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have with us. So I'm just going to share my screen. Sure that all works. Like all science journalists of a certain age, I'm hopeless with technology, but that's probably more to do with age than science. Here we go. Nouha, do you think I could share the screen?
Yes, now it's done.
Now it's done. Great start. Let's get it on. There we go. Share that. Here we go. Can you all see it? Let's go. All right. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about nature first. Nature, as I'm sure everyone on the call will have come across it in some shape or form. These days, I would imagine mostly as an online publication, probably through the articles that we now publish. But Nature was started in 1869, a long time ago now, more than 150 years ago. In the UK, it was established by a publishing family, the Macmillan family, which was the family of many people who were involved in business, but also in British politics, including a former Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, and his descendants continued to own and run the publication and the other parts of the publishing business, because we do books and also other periodicals as well, up until the mid-1990s when the ownership structure changed. Nature's beginnings were very much related to the industrial revolution and the aftermath of the scientific revolution, when scientists particularly did not have that many ways of communicating with each other. And so the publishers, the Macmillan family, they came up with this idea of creating a periodical. Printing was becoming a lot cheaper, and English was very much the language of science communication, along with other particularly European languages. And so this is how really nature began. And as you can see in the title, it said for a long time we were called Illustrated, because a lot of publishing in those days was not illustrated. And so to have an illustration, not so much a photograph, but an actual hand-drawn illustration was a really big deal. I guess it'd be very similar these days to having multimedia content or animation or video in your text. And so this was seen as a big kind of selling point. Just a couple of sort of stats to throw in there. When we were launched, a minority in the world were readers, and a lot of other things were, a lot of other numbers weren't quite what they are now, particularly average global life expectancy. And of course, we are in a different place now to where we were then. Nature is when it started, it was not the first, and probably not an unusual in the publication, in the sense that there were other research journals in many other languages. Nothing on the scale of today, where there are probably millions, I would think. But Nature is still unusual in that we combine publication of original research with journalism, and with other forms of science communication, but particularly journalism. Lots of journals do research publishing and commentary, editorial commentary, other forms of opinion commentary, but doing a lot of journalism quite in the way that we do, combining it with original research publishing, is still, I would say, is a relatively unusual situation for a publisher to be in. And so as part of this particular presentation, I'm going to talk more about the research side of it, and then we can, in the Q&A and the questions, we can talk a bit more about the journalism aspects. And so a lot of you will know about Nature papers that you've come across either in print or of course online. These are just the main criteria that we use for publishing our papers. They've got to be original scientific research, things that have not been published or submitted in other places. They need to have had outstanding scientific importance, and very much increasingly these days of interest to an interdisciplinary readership, because so much of science is specialized now. Even within fields, there are subfields of subfields of subfields. And so we remain very resolutely a general interest publication, a publication that all scientists, regardless of what discipline, feel they have a home, feel that they can read something that interests them, they can contribute something that interests them. So the idea of interdisciplinarity for us is really, really important. Our mission statement, I didn't know this actually until I was thinking about this presentation. I thought it was more recent. It actually hasn't changed since those sort of very, very early days. And this is where you will see that twin mission, that double mission. Firstly, to serve the scientific community through research, and secondly, to enable and ensure that those results are disseminated around the world. And that, to me, that second part to me is the science journalism aspects. So in terms of the kinds of things that we publish, this is just a very, very sort of it's a snapshot. A lot of what we publish is in the area of human origins, as you know. We internally will divide a lot of our papers into the different, not so much the sort of subdisciplinary categories, but within the kind of broader disciplines. So we do biological sciences, physical sciences, and economic and social sciences, engineering, medicine, translational research, and so on. Some of the sort of hotter topics that are coming up, we've been doing a lot for quite a while now. Some of these papers go back until 1980s in the area of stem cells. Quite a bit of the research that we're publishing, from not necessarily from the very, very earliest times, but certainly, since the 20th century at least, has had a policy, a line or an implication in policy making. And one of the best examples that we often talk about is the Montreal Protocol on ozone depletion, which was an international agreement agreed and signed between 1987 and 1989. And this was very much the result of scientific research, which pinpointed chlorofluorocarbons and other gases and other chemicals which were depleting the ozone layer and thinning and creating an ozone hole. And this was clearly having sort of quite serious, particularly health implications. And we were one of the publishers who were publishing that research. More recently, in climate change, climate science, we've been publishing a lot of the papers along with other journals in this field, and particularly in the period I will identify as the period of the late 80s to early and mid 1990s, when there was still a debate. There was still a debate whether or not human activities, particularly burning fossil fuels, is causing global warming. And scientists were unsure, and we published a lot of that debate right up until the mid-90s. And then in the mid-90s, more and more of our papers started confirming that no, there is a very discernible, a very identifiable human fingerprint on climate change. And that really helped to start move the policy-making world, particularly the IPCC, and then of course the other aspects of the UN that are now part of climate policy. More increasingly looking sort of further ahead, we're thinking that if we're going to if we genuinely want to stay true to our interdisciplinary mission, then we need to be doing more in engineering, and so we're definitely publishing more in that area. We're doing much more in social science and social science and policy, and this is again in addition to comment and analysis and our journalism, but also primary research. We have dedicated editors now who are in this sort of area as well. I want to switch a little bit around to the sort of area of the sort of the nature of the scientific enterprise. And those three images on the left, if you like, they represent what would have been many of the people who would have been nature authors around the time that we started, and in the first few decades that followed. And clearly there's a massive shift and a massive change underway in who does science and how science is done. It is, increasingly, moving away from the idea of the single individual, whether it's a Darwin or an Einstein type of person working by themselves, doing their own hypothesizing, their own data collection, their own experimentation, and then not necessarily being that interested in sharing what they're doing or in having it reviewed by others, to a situation where there isn't honestly a huge amount of science that I now see, or that my colleagues see, which isn't done in large or significant multidisciplinary teams, multinational teams, people across, age, gender, other characteristics, working across borders, working in real time, working not in real time. It's just such a different way of doing science compared to when I was a younger person and reading about the history of some of these sort of figures. And I think that increasingly publishers like ourselves are reflecting, or trying to reflect, even if we're not always succeeding, we're trying to reflect this new reality, that the way that in which science is done, the nature of how scientists work, the tools that scientists use is a very different order in terms of how it used to be. And we're trying to reflect that internally, and also in terms of the journalism and some of the commentary and the research publishing that we're doing. So we're very interested in understanding, getting into the sort of the granular detail of scientific collaboration, and often this is work that isn't, strictly speaking, you would say, it's not, that this is more in the sort of realm of social science, particularly quantitative social science or qualitative social science. And so we're looking at, a lot of just trying to understand more and more and reflect some of the research that is happening in that area. We did for a while look at how the pandemic, and I think there was a lot of, it felt to me, at least at the time, from early 2020 into 2021, maybe parts of 2022, that the pandemic would really properly unleash the sort of genie of collaboration, which is talked about, but not maybe fully imbibed, particularly by principal investigators, by senior scientists, of how and talking up and being really proud of the fact that science is a team sport, is a collaborative. And I thought that maybe the pandemic would do it, and there was some early evidence, but I don't know if that's been realized now. I feel that there's quite a long way to go, and maybe that's something that we could talk about in the Q&A. We are thinking much more about science's real abject lack of diversity, and questions around when is science inclusive, when is it not inclusive, why is it not inclusive. And we recently did a whole issue on racism in science, looking back through history and into the present, and that's going to be a theme that we'll continue to focus on in this year. And to be honest, it's not one of those things you can just sort of do once and then say, hey, I've finished it now. It's something that we will be looking at again and again. And we are absolutely not the only publisher. I think, to be honest, every publisher is doing this. I mean, I noticed just a few weeks ago, before the end of last year, that the Lancet, the medical journal, had done a big issue also looking at racism in medicine, in medical research. And so I think these are some of the, it's something that we'll be coming back to. We're always extremely interested in the journey of the early career researcher, and in all of its, and trying to understand it in all of its complexity, and where we can try and make a small difference. I don't think it's something that any one organization can do alone, but there are so many challenges around the early career story, and just recording it, documenting it, reflecting it where we can, campaigning, and talking about it is something that we're also definitely very interested in. And then just finally on this theme, we've just towards the middle of last year and sort of going forwards, we're very conscious that there's been a long history of what's called helicopter research and ethics dumping, where a low and middle income country is used as a place to do research where the regulations and the ethical requirements may not be as stringent as those in other countries. And clearly there is evidence that that researchers and people like ourselves, people who publish research, have not paid enough attention to helicopter research and ethics dumping in the past, and we've made a point of sort of signaling that this is something that we're going to be paying a lot more attention to as we go forward. I could go on there, but I think I'm going to stop now, if that's okay. And very happy to talk about other aspects, other questions that you might have, particularly on the journalism side, but also on the research side. As kind of my job very much sort of straddles, it occupies both of those worlds. So thank you again for your attention, and I'm very happy to be here and happy to take part in your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ehsan, for this short presentation of Nature. But like most of people know Nature magazine, but maybe the question is, because I asked you like during our last meeting this question, what's exactly your title as editor for Editorials?
So there's a little bit of a time lag on the sound, but I think the question was my job title, is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, if you can explain it to our colleagues.
Yeah. So I have. I'm very fortunate in that most of my colleagues either work in the research publishing side or the journalism side of Nature, and there's a few of us, not many, but a few of us, who are very lucky that we can occupy both parts of Nature. And that's essentially where my job resides. So one part of my job is to organize the editorial commentary that Nature provides every week. Now, editorial commentary, one way to think about it is a little bit like the newspapers that you might read or the online publications, where there is a section of the publication where the editors, either the single editor-in-chief or the editors who are the collective voice, they comment on a particular issue that's in the news, and they give the benefit of their opinion on that. And so, like many publications, we have an editorial section as well, and this is the journal's own editorial team. It's about 200 of us, looking at the week's news or looking at something ahead, and then using our collective knowledge, using the research base, using evidence to put across a particular point of view. So just the one that's most recently done, we took a look at the world at the year ahead, looking at COVID, for example. We publish editorials on climate change. We publish editorials on some of the issues that I've mentioned in this presentation around ethics and research, around diversity, around specific aspects in questions in science. And my job is to channel, if you like, that collective voice. So we will have a weekly meeting of all of the editors, and where we'll run through what we're planning on covering, and then in that meeting we'll say, this particular issue we can have a comment about, and then once we make that decision, then my job is to identify the relevant experts on our team. Usually I will find a writer from the writing team with a scientific expert from our research publishing team, and then they will they'll go away, they'll do some thinking, they'll do some brainstorming, and then between them we'll start to produce drafts of the editorial. That text is then peer reviewed internally by all of our colleagues. Everyone has a chance to give their opinion, to comment, and then it's my job, working with the rest of my colleagues, to then see that through to publication. And we do roughly between 90 and 100 of those every year, so about 2 a week. And that's where I get to work with our writers, but also with our scientists, the editors who work on our publishing side. And then the other part of my job is to keep an eye and to oversee our journalism from the Middle East and from Africa. And this is essentially topical science news or topical environmental news that's coming out of the region, or that, if I can call it, as a sort of as a combined region. And so, most recently, for example, we had a team that went to COP20, the climate change conference in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and we covered that. But we also covered that not only as an international climate science and policy story, but we also covered that as a story about the Middle East and about interviewing researchers and policymakers from the region about what are their priorities, what are they thinking, what are their hopes, what are their fears, and so that's the other part of my role. In an ideal world, this would be a full-time job, and I'm hoping one day it will be. It won't be split. But at the moment, I feel like I'm just extremely privileged to be able to do these two roles, because they are, in a sense, they combine my two interests and both of my passions. So that, I hope, Nouha, gives you an idea of my unusual and convoluted job title.
Yeah, thank you for letting me know. And I would like to welcome our colleagues and friends, Mohammed Yahya, the editor, the executive director of Nature in Africa and Middle East. I felt the first time a little bit confused between both of you with your titles. Anyway, it's a huge magazine and it's huge media company. Dua, do you want to ask a question or to share
yes.
your opinion? Go ahead.
No, this time I have a question. So actually, I'm really interested in what you were talking, Ehsan. And my question is, as a medical researcher, and I know what does it mean to publish original research, and then now as a medical journalist, I find sometimes making people interested in the pieces I write as a journalist is harder, because when you publish research, who's going to read it, they are interested researchers, they will be interested. But when you write to the public, from your experience, how we can make people interested in what we write as a journalistic piece?
It's a really difficult question, Dua, because, for two reasons. Firstly, even though I'm an old man now, I am actually not very practiced at communicating with a mass audience. So I began my journalism in nearly 30 years ago, actually a bit more than that, in the early 1990s. And, by, coincidence or maybe by design, for 27, 28 years of that time, most of my journalism has been in the world of the expert. And so a little bit like working for Nature or other publications, where I've concentrated the work that I do in communicating to communities of like-minded or not like-minded experts. And maybe, you could say maybe it's a bit of a cop-out, and that I've run away from the task that you're describing, which is difficult. And I felt that I always felt it was much more challenging to do what you're doing, because, for so many reasons, the reasons that you say, that how do you make something that is essentially or initially only of interest to experts, how do you make that interesting and relevant to a much broader audience? And I think it's a really, really difficult ask. And I spent a little bit of time working in newsrooms in newspapers, and I didn't last very long, because I could see straight away that the requirements of the newsroom and the needs of readers made it more difficult for me to concentrate on accuracy and nuance. And as we know, all of us on this call, and I'm sure others, that so much of science communication rests on the requirement that, yes, we be accessible, and everyone who needs to understand us can understand us, but we don't compromise accuracy. And it's a tension, and it's a very difficult tension to resolve. But I found that when I worked in mass media briefly, I just failed to be faithful to, you know, all of the different points of view and perspectives that are essential in accurate science communication, with the need for the newsroom editor going, I need one headline, I need one story, I need one point of view, you know, and so I struggled, and I'd be interested to hear what other colleagues here who maybe they work in mass media, you know, how are they I know Mohammed has experience, and I saw Batina on the call as well, and I know they have experience of this. But I think those of us who work in the expert world, I don't think we necessarily are the best people to address the specifics of your question, Doa, because in a way we've sort of taken the easy path, which is, you know what, we have, I don't know, like so many hundreds of thousands of readers, and they're all scientists, and they understand the rules of science, and yes, they have lots of arguments and debates amongst themselves, but they don't question the importance of science, the importance of evidence, the importance of honesty, rigor, accuracy. And I can kind of live with that. That's my community, and I can be happy and speak to that. And I don't want to step outside the sort of much more complicated, much more argumentative world of the mass media, where there are so many other, you know, issues. And so, you know, it's not answering your question necessarily, but I think it's maybe hopefully helping you to explain why I personally have tried to stay in the specialist world, and which I know is not the answer to your question.
Yeah, but I totally understand, because when you talk to experts, it's much easier, especially about the uncertainty part, and that you don't have to negotiate the importance, as you said, the importance of evidence and evidence-based practices.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So what is I mean, your experience? What is your advice? You know, how do you? I mean, you're a researcher who's now moved into this brave world. You know, what's your experience? I'd be interested. Others maybe too.
So my experience actually, especially because I'm working in medicine and as a medical doctor, I all the time I deal with public, and you know, we read the evidence, we study the evidence, and then we go to the public and to tell them the things they need to know. So sometimes the whole day I do science communication with my patients, with the public they are asking, but especially when it comes to writing. And when I'm writing a piece about a disease, or I'm writing a piece about the health condition in one of the sectors or one of the minorities we have in my community, so I think about it sometimes, what will make people be more interested in what I'm writing. And sometimes I find people really interested, especially if they are working in the same sector, or if they had experience in volunteerism, or in near topics, and sometimes I feel people, they act like this is irrelevant to us. So I'm still new in the field, so I wanted to get some advice from you.
Maybe
Yeah.
Nouha, we could get somebody, you know, as one of your speakers, you know, who's got experience of this, and I'd love to hear from them as well.
I would like to share an experience with you. Maybe you have like, it should be like a local issue to make the audience interested in your subject. I organized last November during the Francophone Summit an event in Tunisia about neglected tropical disease, and I found that Tunisian people are not interested because it's not something like local. So that's why when you write a paper or an article in general, you have to think about your target audience, and you are not like obliged to make it interesting for all the people.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the relevance aspect of it is 100%. Yeah.
Anyone else have a question? Batina, Zina, okay, maybe I have like a familiar question. It's about the crucial skills for science journalists in general. even we have like advanced
the skill as well. Yes, I could definitely talk about that. I would say the number one skill has to be curiosity. If there's one skill out of, if I were to rank them or rate them, I would say curiosity about anything has to be the first thing, because to find out about things, you have to be obsessed with the word why. And I'm probably lucky that I have it more innate, and I didn't necessarily need to be trained, but it can be trained as well. It's part of the training that goes into in the programs of journalism schools, science communication schools. So always being obsessed with the why question is a really, really important skill. And in a way, those of us who come into science journalism and we're not necessarily experts ourselves, it's not a difficult question, because we don't know literally anything, and we're coming to a story often for the first time. Even when you get to my age, I'm continuously discovering things that I had very little idea about, and so just constantly asking the why is this, why is that, and the how, but I think more than that, the why question. So curiosity I think is a really important skill. When you're working with scientists, then it's really important to be attentive to detail. And it's important to be attentive to detail in anything, I think it's just an important life skill, to be quite obsessed by the details. And but when you're working with researchers, when you're on the phone to a researcher and you're interviewing them, then I think being attentive to details is quite important. And it helps you with your sources, that when you're asking people questions, if you've read the paper and if you understand something of the terminology, then I think it just helps to they appreciate it. They definitely open doors as well. So those are sort of two definite really, really important aspects. I mean, in addition to obviously, having a good level of literacy and being able to, and having practice at writing, that's just a given. I these days, we talk about data, and it's always been a sort of assumption that a science journalist will have data skills. But I think it's really important just to overly and re-emphasize that. And before, the skill was mostly in being able to understand and interpret data, and to understand its strengths and its limitations, particularly its weaknesses, when you're trying to draw conclusions from data. These days, those skills now include the skill of collecting data, manipulating data, adding to data, cleaning up data, augmenting data, merging data. So along with the skills with the words, with the language, I would now equally put emphasis on the skills with data, almost as a language, thinking of data as a language skill, like we would consider English or Arabic or French as a language, and just adding that. So those would be three of the skills that I would put emphasis on.
Thank you. I think Dua has another question. As I mentioned at the beginning of this meetup, that you are a science policy journalist. So she asked about that.
I'll go ahead with your question, Dua. What's your question?
Dua, feel free to ask a question.
Yeah. So in the intro, Nouha said that you are a science policy journalist, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to hear more about this. Do you work with policymakers? Do you do lobbying, roundtables? What do you do? Yeah, advocacy. So
I guess pretty much from the beginning, or when I started, I wasn't only interested in just the research or the content of the research, and I just always felt that what I want to write about is, once we have the piece of science or the finding or the knowledge, then what happens to it? How does it impact people? How does it impact societies? How does it impact the environment? How does it impact business? How does it impact government, finance, economics, and and so on? Religions, and that you could sort of I would bundle that into policy. The relationship between ideas and knowledge and decision making. In the sort of academic world, there's a whole field called history of ideas. So maybe my interest in science journalism is bringing the study of history of ideas into the practice of science journalism. Is what happens when an innovation or an idea then gets out into the world? How does it affect money and decision making and policy making? So that's sort of one whole area. And then there is another side to science policy, which is the policy making of science itself. Who decides which fields are up and which fields are down? How do decisions get made about funding? Who is the science minister today? Who will be the science minister tomorrow? What about ethics? Does science pay enough attention to ethics? Can we do more? Should we be doing more? What about public engagement? Your first question, Dora, about science and public engagement. And so essentially the nexus of science and decision making is where, if you did a sort of Google search for most of the articles that I've written in Nature and a few in other places, that's probably one thing that unites it all, is this sort of obsession, almost fascination, with the relationship between science and its impacts, but particularly its impacts in the policy world in different countries. So it's very much a niche. It's a minority interest, or it has been, because I think after the pandemic, I think that has really changed. I think the pandemic has really brought policy making and the relationship between science and evidence and policy into a much more mainstream place than perhaps it used to be.
Good. Another interesting questions from Mohammed Yahya about ChatGPT. As we know, it was launched by OpenAI in November 22. So, we talked about the link between technology and science journalism. So the question was, you can read it in the chat. Can you share some thoughts on how this tool would affect science journalism? And Dr. Qabil said also that he's afraid about that. With the link with academia at the same time. I think it affects all the fields, not only science. So
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think both Dr. Tariq and Mohammed are both on the money. I mean, I think just on the journalism side, I think it's early days, but I think it's going to be huge. I really think it's going to be huge. Probably one of the biggest innovations that people like me will see in our lifetimes, and I'm sure there are others to come, but I think it's going to be huge, because all of a sudden, the present iteration of ChatGPT, is still a work in progress, but of course, potentially billions of people are going to be using it if they're not already using it, and it's training itself on those queries, and it's training itself, and of course that's on the front end. And in the back end, the developers are constantly, revising their algorithms and also revising the data sets on which it's being trained. So it's kind of being refined from both ends. And it will get to a point where I think a little bit like, when we first used Google, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't write queries in sentences, like what is the weather tomorrow, or we didn't do what we do with things like Siri. Now that has changed, and I think something similar will probably happen with ChatGPT. I think there are potentially lots of answers, but I think the main answer that I would say is that it is going to make, I'm confident that it's going to make a lot of our lives. It's going to change the kind of work that we do, and I'll give you one or two examples. So a lot of my life, and a lot of, I suspect, the science writers on the call, we have to spend our time reading papers, and in some cases, reading quite dense papers or dense reports, 100-page report or 200-page report. what this kind of software can do, and this isn't the only one, there are others, Yahoo has developed one and there are others as well, is that this sort of application of machine learning is going to completely simplify, potentially simplify the idea that you need to spend sort of 3 hours summarizing or synthesizing a piece of research when you can have it done much faster. Possibly a little bit like how those of you who used log tables to do your calculations before the pocket calculator arrived. When I was in school in the 1970s and 1980s, we were still using logarithmic tables, these books of tables, to do our sort of more complex calculations. And in my last year of school, in 1983, calculators were permitted. And there was a huge debate about this is going to make the kids slow and they won't understand the sort of origins of the calculations they're doing, and do they need it? And of course, nobody asks or thinks about those things. So I reckon that something similar may end up happening here, that we are right now thinking about what are the implications and what is this going to do to children's learning, to the world of science and so on. But we're just going to imbibe it as this technology becomes better, and and potentially for me it could lead to much more exciting science journalism. If I've only got a day to report a story, and up till now I needed 2 hours to read the paper and to understand what's in it, now I can do that in minutes. Then it just gives me potentially more time to understand the implications, to pick up the phone, to get some comment, to get some analysis. So I'm kind of hopeful. I'm on the more hopeful end in that respect. Quite what it will do to science, I don't know. So it was a question that we were just discussing in a editorial meeting before your call started. So I think it's a bit of a watch this space. But I think for the way that we work as editors and writers, I'm kind of I want to be optimistic about this, and that's certainly where I sit at the moment. I don't know if you're on the call, Mohammed. I'd be interested to know what you think, because I know you are also very interested in this. What's your view? Is Mohammed around?
Well, I am, yes. I just sent the question a little bit earlier. Hi, Ehsan. Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of science journalists are, well, a lot of journalists, to be honest, are struggling with and debating. And I love your positive outlook on it. I can see how it can be quite useful and how it could be an extra tool for a lot of journalists to use. But like you say, I mean, I think this, I think what worried a lot of people is this just came as a bit of a surprise that it is so good at doing what it does, and it's still being refined. So this is not the final version, or not the last that we will see, the highest quality we will see of it, I must say. But also, I think you make a very good point that it could be a tool that frees some of the time that we spend doing certain tasks we don't really like or appreciate, to give us a chance to do more creative work, let's say, or to focus on the creativity, which is what makes a piece of content better than another, I guess. So it's a nice way to, I mean, a more positive way to look at it would be that it would free time that can go towards other things that we as science journalists could be and should be doing, I think.
I hope so. Yeah, that's the hope. I mean, obviously there's always risks, but I think that's definitely one of the hopes. I hope so. Yeah. Thank you, Mohammed. Good to have you. There was one other question.
We still have 5 minutes. Any other question? And thank you again, Mohammed, for the question. It was an interesting question because it's like topic we're talking about this last day.
I think
yeah, I have another question actually.
Go ahead.
if we have time. Yeah. Also, I want to ask you, Ehsan, as from your experience too, but this time as an editor for the Middle East and Africa branch of Nature, that what is your advice or recommendations after dealing with, let's say, experts and scientists from the area, from our area? What do you recommend researchers living or scientists living in these countries, in the Middle East and Africa, to be working on more, or how they can develop more their science, their publishing outcomes, and how they can reach more to the public?
Oh, that's another.
Maybe I want to add the details before
go ahead.
Yeah, you know that reaching out, as like, maybe it's easy for you to reach out a scientist from the MENA more than us, because they give more importance to nature. So it's a little, sometimes it's a little bit difficult for us to be in contact with the researcher. But when you present, I think yourself that you're editor of Nature.
No, you're right. I totally recognize I have this sort of extraordinary privilege. And the first time I realized it was when I started working for Nature a long time ago now. Was it was my first day in the office. I was assigned a story, and I was told who I should ring, and I rang them, and then I went for lunch, thinking, well, I'll have the rest of the day to, I don't know, do other things. And as soon as I came back to my desk, there were like 3 notes on my desk saying, Professor this has called you back, and Professor this has called you back, and just the very idea that somebody would ring you back, which never happened to me before in my journalism, just sort of showed that this organization has a particular place in scientists. The one thing I would really recommend is, and I know it's already happening, in fact, is to be part of associations. And I think, where, and this doesn't necessarily apply just in the Middle East, but I would say worldwide. I'm a part of the Science Writers Association of the UK. It's called the Association of British Science Writers. There are many, and I think because there's always strength in those numbers. And having scientists speak to associations, having them be part of associations, having science writers and science journalist associations do events, and to be able to create that understanding that it's important. Why is it important for researchers to be talking to journalists, to be confident about their relationships, particularly with science journalists? A lot of researchers, when they hear the word journalist, they just sort of want to hide under the bed, or just pretend they don't exist because they don't know. They always have this sort of very visceral fear of being misquoted and misunderstood, and I think knowing that they're talking to science journalists hopefully will give them that confidence that science journalists, we work to, I would like to think we work to a higher standard than journalists in other fields, and we hold ourselves to account because we're part of these associations. And so I think building, essentially building that infrastructure, which I know exists already, of course, in the Middle East, in the Arabic-speaking countries, and also in African countries. I think that would be the one thing I would say.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's been great.
Okay, so my sincere thanks to our speaker today, Ehsan Masood, editor for Editorials and Leadership for Africa and the Middle East, Nature, and to all our webinar participants, including those who posted questions, especially Dua. Dr. Dua, thank you so much for your contribution today.
Dr. Dua wins the award for the best questions.
Yeah, exactly. So the next meeting will happen in 2 weeks as a reminder. So you can review this webinar on our Facebook group, Science Journalists in MENA. And if any participant would like to join our WhatsApp group, please email me after this webinar and I will be happy to add you to our group. I would like also to acknowledge those who have contributed to the success of our WhatsApp group again this last week. Thank you for being a part of this community. We continue working on promoting science journalism in the region, and our next meetup will be on the 17th of January with another guest. Thank you for everyone for your presence. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Nouha. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. You have a great day. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.